Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Political Vigilante Roadshow edition. I'm in a wonderful hotel room, um, doing some shows on the road, and I want to go into some stuff. I'm sorry I've said this before, but unfortunately, the video from the Political Vigilante live at Podfest was damaged, so it was not usable. But the audio for the live version with Ron Placone and John Updike is available on iTunes and Patreon. So it was a fun weekend. It's been a little crazy to go right from Podfest to traveling. So losing that video, I mean, it's why I lost a couple days. But I'm back at it. I want to cover an article that was submitted by Patreon backer Adam Martin. And it's an article that was in the New York Times from Stephanie Kelton, and she was an economic advisor for the Sanders campaign and is a big advocate of modern monetary theory, something I'm just becoming acquainted with. And the article that was submitted by Adam Martin was an op-ed piece in the New York Times, and it's entitled "How We Think About the Deficit is Mostly Wrong." And it's really focusing on Trump talking about delivering the biggest tax cut in history. I'll put this article in the show notes. It came out October 5th. So a lot of people, this Trump's tax cut, they're saying it's going to put the deficit from 5 up to 7 trillion if this happens. And that makes a lot of people go, oh no, like Bob Corker, the Republican from Tennessee, him and Trump have gotten into a big fight over this. And what this article, obviously this will be big tax breaks for the rich. Of course it would. But this article goes into some very interesting stuff, and I'll cover it about the misconceptions about the deficit that I wasn't quite aware of myself. So it's something that I think we should cover to make us more aware of stuff. So here, I'll read some excerpts. Are the proposed tax cuts a huge giveaway to the rich? Most definitely. Will they, as advertised, create a booming economy with benefits that trickle down to everyone else? No. It'll just widen the gap between the rich and the poor. And the tax cuts won't do much to promote broad-based consumer spending or overall job growth. That's enough to reject the plan, but it would be unwise to oppose tax cuts or any other federal legislation simply because they add to the deficit. Why? Because bigger deficits wouldn't wreck the nation's finances. I didn't know that. Unfortunately, budgetary effects are the sun around which everything revolves in Washington. Should we invest $1 trillion in our crumbling infrastructure, offer Medicare for all, or pass the biggest tax cut in the nation's history? Propose any of these, and of course, the first question on everyone's lips will be, how are you going to pay for it? Right. And so, and we talk about this a lot on the show. Single payer. How are you going to help? How are you going to pay for it? How are you going to pay for it? I've always proposed, and as is Jimmy Dore and many other progressives, cut the military budget. That's one way to pay for these things. That you have actual money to do it. But what Stephanie Kelton is saying is that actually, the way governments work, deficits, because you have tax revenue, it's not necessarily just like we think of it in terms of ourselves, like, oh God, I have all this credit card debt. How can I do this or whatever? And it's a little more involved than that. So here, what she says, actually, the math always adds up. To see why, we have to look beyond the government's balance sheet. Think of it this way. Government spending adds new money to the economy, and the taxes take some of that money out again. It's a constant churning of pluses and minuses, and their minuses become our pluses. See, that's a great point if you think about it. Oh, the government goes into debt to do all this government spending, but government spending fuels the economy. If it's small business loans, if it's infrastructure, if it's schools, if it's whatever, it goes back in there. Even if somebody is just given a government check, they're given handouts, they're still going to buy stuff, which infuses the economy. And then there's the sales tax, so they get some of that money back. That makes a lot of sense. When the government spends more than it gets in taxes, a quote deficit unquote is recorded on the government's books, but that's only half the story. A little double entry bookkeeping paints the rest of the picture. Suppose the government spends $100 into the economy but collects $90 in taxes, leaving behind an extra $10 for someone to hold. The extra 10 gets recorded as a surplus on somebody else's books. That means the government's minus 10 is always matched by plus 10 in some other parts of the economy. There's no mismatch and no problem with things adding up. Balance sheets must balance, after all. The government's deficit is always mirrored in an equivalent surplus in another part of the economy. See, that's really interesting. I hadn't thought of it that way. It's pretty simple if you think about it. And what the article goes into is she goes, the problem is then, politicians then, I'm creating to the deficit. Nobody wants to be around that around their neck. And then most Americans don't think of it this way. And of course, the mainstream media is not going to explain it to you this way because, well, the corporate machine wants all of us in debt anyway. So that's how we're going to think about everything. They want us overworked and in debt. So we're not really paying attention to what they're doing. Why would that be? Americans are vulnerable to nationalist scare tactics that warn of the perils of relying on foreigners to pay our bills. Right? China's going to come in, they own our debt, which they do. They do. And they're not going to finance our deficits. In fact, we should think of the government's spending as self-financing since it pays its bills by sending new money into the economy. That's a good approach. When there's a deficit, some of that new money can be traded in for a government bond. What's often missed in the public debate is the fact that the money to buy the bond comes from the deficit spending itself. What isn't missed is the fact that the government pays interest on those bonds. Lawmakers are obsessed with this line item in the budget, as if it's akin to a cable bill that keeps getting bigger and bigger. It isn't. Unlike a household, the government doesn't have to trim other parts of its budget to make ends meet. Congress can always create more room in the budget by adding rows to widening the columns to put more resources into education, infrastructure, defense, and so on. It's purely a political decision. Well, this is really interesting. It's really interesting, this article. Perhaps no one is more skilled in the dark art of deficit deception than Representative Paul Ryan, the House Speaker. He has described the budget outlook as a fiscal train wreck, and he has demanded cuts to programs like Social Security and Medicare in the name of protecting future generations from crushing burden of debt. His language is poll-tested and inflammatory by design. It's intended to create a sense of urgency to move the budget into balance where we are told the math of federal spending will finally add up. That's fantastic, pointing out that bullshit. In a more rational world, lawmakers would abandon the crude CBO scoring model and recognize that the risk of overspending is inflation, not bankruptcy. They would avoid fruitless battles over the debt ceiling, and they would acknowledge that their deficit itself could be deployed as a potent weapon in fights against inequality, poverty, and economic stagnation. This is all real good points. I still think we need to cut the military budget way down. I'd love to just see that money put there directly. But this is a good point. And thank you so much, Adam Martin, for submitting this and all the Patreon supporters.